as I was observing just the deterioration of finishes, including earthen floors that we had just put our heart and soul and backs into, I just realized that there has to be a better way. There has to be new forms of chemistry that provide greater durability because nature does it all the time. Nature is constantly taking pure, low embodied energy ingredients. And as a materials engineer, as an alchemist, nature is turning those basic raw materials into enduring high quality shells and bones and barks all the time.
Welcome to the Regenerative Real Estate Podcast, a show about human environments and how they can be used as a force for good. Conversations that educate and inspire people looking for a different way to do real estate. I'm Neil Collins, and on the show today, how Emily Majewski went from working in horticulture in Buffalo, New York, to moving her family across the continent to Mexico. There, she found herself getting her hands dirty, learning how to build with earthen materials, and to go on to create the natural building material company Phytostone. Have you ever gone into a hardware store like Home Depot or Lowe's and just been completely overwhelmed with the dizzying amount of choices that you have? I'm talking about things like flooring, paint, glues, siding, and more. You can spend hours just trying to figure out what kind of hardwood flooring you want to put down. You may not realize it, but there's an incredible amount of research and development that goes into the building material industry each year. Yet, despite the increasing number of products available to purchase, I'm pretty sure you'd be hard-pressed to find any that are created to be both non-toxic and good for people and the planet. On today's show, we get to dive into the work of Emily Majewski and listen to her educational journey into developing building materials that are truly an expression of nature. Now, I'm going to say this was a really fun show because this was our first live episode of the Regenerative Real Estate Podcast. And it was fun to be able to open up the conversation for listeners of this show to participate in creating it. Now, I had the opportunity to visit Emily this past winter, where she lives on the Pacific coast in Mexico. And when we were eating dinner, she pulled out of her bag a small black textured brick. In fact, as I'm recording this right now, I've got the little briquette in front of me sitting on my windowsill. And I was amazed when she went on to tell me about how she's using biochar, a charcoal-like substance that's made by burning organic material from agriculture and forestry waste, to create building materials that are both good for interior air quality and good for the environment. In this episode, we cover a lot of ground, from Emily moving her family to a different country, to her becoming fascinated by natural building. So much so that she studied patents, read studies, tested and iterated her own experiments to create a line of building materials that can hopefully play a role in shifting the way we build buildings. So for everybody that is just tuning in now on the podcast, you've got about 20 people that are watching this live. If you would like to participate in these kinds of events, we hold these kinds of live forums every first Tuesday of the month. You can easily Google in Mighty Networks Regenerative Real Estate so that you can be alerted to these events. But this is a podcast that I originally started just out of a passion project. And it was conversations that we were having behind closed doors, my partner Alyssa and I, of what does it look like to incorporate sustainability into real estate. About a year ago, we went searching on the internet for somebody that was doing material development work, who was doing healthy materials. Because one thing that you'll find quickly, if you start to go down the really scary rabbit hole of how we are constructing our world and what materials that we're using. It's pretty easy to see that we're using materials that are extremely environmentally destructive. But if you start to look at the health statistics, that's the most alarming thing for me, is that we've seen cancer rates explode, where a century ago they were about 1 in 100 people. And now 1 in 2 people, males, are in the most high risk category, are going to be developing cancer within their lifetime. 1 in 3 females, it's a little bit better. And then people will say, well, people are living longer now. But that does not explain why 52% of our kids before they're 17 are going to develop a chronic illness they're going to be having to deal with for the rest of their lives. And so you start to realize that it's the building materials that we're using, the air that we're breathing, the food that we're eating. And that's why it was such a pleasure to find Emily's work with a company called Phytostone. And this is where we're going to introduce you, Emily. Emily, welcome to the Regenerative Real Estate Podcast. It is a pleasure to have you on today.
Thank you, Neil. Thanks for having me. It's my pleasure.
And Emily, I know where you're physically at right now, but why don't you share with our guests and our audience where you physically are at this moment?
Yes, so I'm American, but have been living down in Mexico for about 11 years now. So we are on the West Coast, an hour north of Puerto Vallarta. So the humid tropics, and very, very different climate than the Northeast where we came from. So that was a big adjustment in every way, but particularly our understanding of architecture, design, materials, horticulture, all of my passions being transplanted down here was a real, I don't want to say rude awakening, but definitely the feeling of needing to start over and learning best practices from the ground up in this new climate. So my background is actually horticulture and landscape architecture, but that has evolved since moving to Mexico.
Well, let's pick it up from the background story. Where did you grow up, and what was the trajectory of life whenever you're young?
Yeah, well, for me, when I was very, very young, early teens, I kind of had this headline of how I wanted to organize my life around this statement. And for me, that statement was about finding synergy between nature and culture. I was homeschooled, so I was super nerdy. I know like most 14-year-olds probably aren't thinking about that, but this idea of synergy and how our current status is very adversarial and very competitive, the relationship between nature and culture. And I think we all know that it doesn't have to be that way. And so I fell in love with horticulture at an also very early age. Gardens, plants, ethnobotany, garden design. And so I started on this very plant-focused trajectory, numerous internships at historic gardens throughout the East Coast and abroad. And then I went to school at a vocational program in Ontario called the Niagara Parks Commission School of Horticulture, which was this like West Point for horticulture. And I stayed in residential design as well as permaculture projects for years after graduating. My husband and I founded an urban farm in Buffalo, New York for a couple of years before moving to Mexico. And throughout all of that evolution was this focus on integrating nature into our lives through our spaces and through our gardens, and how the individual and the relationship that we have with our property, with our space, with our garden, we're like this microcosm of what a positive relationship could be between nature and culture, only it's on an individual and their home and garden scale. And then when we moved down here and kind of had a starting over of our lives, practically speaking, that question began to flip in terms of not just how do we experience nature through our gardens, but how do we bring nature indoors so that we're interfacing with nature through the materiality of our space? And there's the reason for that kind of inside out flip of the focus, nature from the outside in and from the inside out. I think that was largely due to the fact that we lived in a camper for the first 4 years of being in Mexico, a very tiny 10 by 19 space, which was a first time experience, especially raising a baby. And really pushed up the idea of home and what should home look like to the top of my agenda, starting a family in a tiny home off grid. So yeah, I would say that that began kind of a spiritual focus on, okay, we've got gardens covered. Now, what does home look like? And that started me on a complementary but different trajectory.
Well, let's back it up one step, because there is a big life decision that I'm sure listeners would really want to unpack. What incentivizes, or what was the motivating decision between picking up out of Buffalo, New York, and moving to a different country after you've started an urban farm versus staying?
Yes, we'd spent years. My husband was in horticulture as well. We met in the industry, and we were focused on a lot of alternative types of projects, like refugee community gardens, urban farming, habitat preservation, urban habitat, things like that. Buffalo in particular is this incredible melting pot for refugees, particularly out of Iraq and Somalia and Myanmar. And so we were in a very, very diverse neighborhood, and our urban farm project was just an incredible deep dive into bringing people together that don't speak the same language, but all have food traditions that can converge through urban production. But at that time, because this was the Northeast, so your career is seriously hampered by the winter time. Up till that point, both my husband and I would always travel in the winters and see gardens and things like that around the world. But we got to a point where we decided we would start our family, and that kind of, bohemian 20-something backpacking lifestyle isn't necessarily conducive to starting a family. I mean, some people pull it off, but at that time, my husband's sister, she had moved down to Mexico actually 10 years prior. So we had a bit of a stepping stone down here. And we decided when we were kind of designing the type of lifestyle that we would want to provide our child, we decided being in a warmer climate, which provided access to being outside year round with a very low energy footprint, was important to us. And also the ability to shrink our cost of living so that we didn't have to feel impelled to work so much, and we could really absorb those early years of babyhood and toddlerhood. And Mexico really fit the bill for that. And we were really along the way piecing together just how much energy it takes earning money just to stay warm for 7 or 8 months of the year. A lot of people don't really think about that. And so we just started reevaluating by transplanting ourselves, how much energy, personal time and energy could we save not needing to bring in income to keep ourselves warm. And I know that sounds very primordial and basic, but it's one of those underlying facts of life that no one really questions until the grid goes down in a freak storm. And then all of a sudden you realize, oh, just the degree of the dependency. So we were hoping to off-pack some of that layer to our lifestyle, and relocate based on cost of living and climate, carbon footprint, and being able to provide an outdoor lifestyle year round to our child.
What does that look like moving as an expat to a country that your sister was there, it sounds like, but how do you integrate in, and what did life look like for you to get established? Because I know that you're in a particular community.
Yes. So we spent the first year and a half in Vallarta, just kind of getting our bearings. I had never been to Mexico before, didn't speak a lick of Spanish personally. And, at that time, that initial urban experience down here of just getting to focus on the throes of new parenthood was really ideal. We came down with some savings and we could just relax and survive sleep deprivation. It worked out really wonderful. And at that point, we had been horticulture nerds for 15 years, both my husband and myself. And it was a good time to do something we had never done before. And so once we got down here, we started fermenting in our house for ourselves, kimchi, sauerkrauts, pickles. And, if you'll bear in mind, this was 10 years ago, so it wasn't quite the renaissance at that time that it is right now. It was just the beginnings of the resurgence of interest in that. And then people started knocking on the door, asking us to make them fermented goods. And so we kind of got swept into this whole market scene while we were down here making artisan fermented foods. And that was really, we had never been involved in food other than the growing of vegetables in our lives. Like preparing food, offering food was a total departure for us. But it was, a cash flow, something that allowed us to work from home, be our own bosses. But it was very unexpected, and it really grew. And it was super interesting to see the consciousness and the knowledge of people just accelerating during those years of probiotics being such a fringe concept to going mainstream and witnessing that, But our ultimate goal was to find land. And we were very, very naive about the cost of land in this area. I think a lot of people assume that Mexico, or a third world type country, transitional country, there's this huge disparity in cost of living. It's not as much as one would think, especially if you're in a more quickly developing tourist type of zone. It does get quite expensive, but it was basically through a friend of a friend we learned about an ecological ranch that was looking for a family to help them manage 3 hectares. So we offered our services. We had our camper, and our market business was very portable at the time. And we set up shop here on this trial basis and put in a solid 4 years of getting to know this other family, establishing a level of trust, sweating it out in a camper and an off-grid manual artisan business. So yeah, it was definitely an adventure, and there was a lot of suffering along the way of adjusting to being in a tiny space off grid and not having hot water and not having electricity. And so it really bumped up this concept of home and as far as what we were going to build for ourselves once we had established trust in the situation, like what we were going to do. So then that catapulted us in this materials and design for home type of pathway. Yeah.
Whenever we connected, you were telling me an amazing story about your first house build. I believe it was an earth bag.
Yeah.
Is that right? Do you want to give everybody just a glimpse into first what an earth bag is, and tell us how it actually went.
Yes. So earth bag building is it's a methodology of building that, if you imagine sandbags, those same bags can be produced in long tubes that you fill with earth, which you compact. It has to be 8 rows that you build up. And in between these rows of compacted earth bags, you have almost like a barbed wire, but it acts like a Velcro between the layers, and you build up. And we chose that style because it was the default style already happening on the property where we live. Now, having had that experience, it really did just catapult us in this deep dive of research on alternative building, alternative materials. And I think we went down the path that a lot of people typically, it's a knee-jerk reaction when you reject concrete and you reject conventional methods. You automatically just look backwards in time of thinking, okay, well, lime finishes, clay, adobe, earth construction. The tendency is to look backwards and try and recreate historical, natural building methods, designs, materials. However, the conclusion that we drew after this whole earth bag building experience, so that's going back 7 years, I believe, was that it is not the way forward at all. Heritage materials and these very labor-intensive DIY alternative building methods, they're fine on a small scale, and they are certainly better than the conventional methods, designs, materials as far as being human health and earth friendly. It's certainly superior, but it's not the solution, because quite frankly, we discovered that a lot of these heritage materials like adobe and lime, they were extremely inexpedient to install, and they did not hold up well to normal wear and tear by a modern family. They didn't hold up to modern standards and modern expectations for durability. So they were healthy and benign ingredients and natural, but they were not very practical. It is so labor intensive and time consuming. And we started to piece together that, this is fine for your odd DIY loving owner builder project, but it's not relevant to urban scenarios, for example, at all, where time is money and things need to be built fast, and you need standardization with your materials and your methods, and you need to meet building codes. And considering the macro trends around the world towards urbanization and super cities, it almost seemed frivolous to be focused on technologies and techniques that could only impact a tiny amount of people and the fringe, essentially. And so this experience really highlighted for me the importance of, we're at a point where we need to hybridize the best of what worked in the past, let's say healthy natural ingredients, but turn them into something new and modern, and combine that with the best of what the modern world has to offer. So I am thoroughly convinced that this solution is not turning back the clock. It's about taking the best of the old and the best of the new and fusing that together into finding new ways forward.
How did you first start applying this thought process and this idea? Did it show up in building materials? Because I know that you are also doing natural paints. So take the direction any way you want to go to, because I think that where we're really taking this conversation is, what are you developing and how does that show up in projects that you're working on?
So We started, as I mentioned, with lime and adobe for our finishes. And we all love to put lime on a pedestal, and lime is great. It's an incredible material. Basically, when I say lime, I'm referring to a form of calcium oxide, calcium hydroxide, the form of calcium that's all over the world that humans have been building with for thousands of years. Um, However, the practical applications of working with lime is that, especially when it's fresh, especially when you're dealing with calcium oxide, which is quicklime, which is the same material we put on carcasses and dead bodies to decompose them quickly, is that you're working with an incredibly caustic material. And so it is very hard on your body as an installer. Like, I'll give you an example. We'd be applying lime and handling the powder, and the powder would be landing on our sweaty skin, and your skin would start bleeding. It would start eating away at your skin immediately just from normal sweat of working with it. And the dust gets in your lungs, and it's very, very aggravating, because you're talking like a pH 12, 13. And so any material that is so high pH, either alkaline or is very acidic, is very uncomfortable from an installer's perspective, which was our perspective. And along those lines, it requires very specific curing conditions, where if you don't meet those conditions, it's a lot of babying of the material as it cures properly. If you don't meet the right conditions, you have a very dusty finish, and that dust and that aggravating dust is something you breathe and live with for the duration of your experience of that home. When it comes to the adobe finishes, again, it's just such a primordial, incredible material, and pure and benign. But in terms of raising a family surrounded by adobe finishes, you have one child kicks a ball into the wall and you have a chunk of your plaster fall off. It's not very practical, at least for modern standards. So as I was observing just the deterioration of finishes, including earthen floors that we had just put our heart and souls and backs into, I just realized that there has to be a better way. There has to be new forms of chemistry that provide greater durability, because nature does it all the time. Nature is constantly taking pure, low embodied energy ingredients. And as a materials engineer, as an alchemist, nature is turning those basic raw materials into enduring, high quality shells and bones and barks all the time. So I started researching all kinds of restoration journals, patents that are open source by Google. And what I found was that when ordinary Portland cement was invented in the mid 1800s, it's kind of this 100 monkey phenomenon happening at that time. There were at least a dozen simultaneous inventions happening for artificial stone, because that's what I figured out we need to do. We need to create an artificial stone that can be poured in any shape, but is natural and doesn't require the high energy price tag that concrete has. And so I started just going down that research rabbit hole of reading literally thousands of patents going back 200 years, and patents from around the world, including China, including Russia, and realizing that there's whole families of chemistry formulations using natural materials. It just so happens that concrete won out in the end, because its raw materials were so universally available, and it was subsidized by the discovery of fossil fuels, which at the time no one thought And he never gave it a second thought in terms of the economics or the future availability of fossil fuels. So because it requires incredible amounts of fossil fuels to create cement clinker, I'm talking fusion temperatures that can melt stone. You're literally melting limestone and slate. That one won because fossil fuels were cheap and the ingredients were all over the world. And that dominated the world paradigm that, as we know it today, we have officially superseded the volume of biomass on the Earth's crust by concrete and similar materials. We now have more human-made concrete type materials than biomass in the world right now. But I started researching alternative chemistries and buying sacks of minerals, which are readily available in Mexico. Mexico is a very mineral-rich country. And I started experimenting in my backyard by headlight, especially at night, and several years of literally experimenting in my backyard and failing, like so many failures. But the beautiful thing is about failing fast is all you need is that 1% of success. And then you just start honing that. And so as this journey continued of having a market business, living off grid, and in my off hours experimenting with alternative chemistries to create artificial stone, or you could also argue artificial seashell type of formulation, how nature creates shells or how nature creates stone. We started developing some successful recipes that became the foundation to our company now.
So I have got a brick in my hand that you developed, a biochar brick. Let's talk about some of the applications that you started to really iterate on, and like moving into really seeing this as a product that you can sell to the world. Like, how does that show up, and why are people really seeking these out?
Yes. So initially, the first couple of years, we were focused on mineral-based applications for creating natural plasters, which could also do double duty as natural flooring, troweled on like an earthen floor. And yeah, focusing on mineral-based applications that were pure, natural, but also super strong, equivalent to concrete, or at least 3/4 of the way towards concrete level strength. So just more appropriate for modern living. I started getting fascinated by biochar as a scalable solution towards carbon drawdown. And I started developing an interest in how do we combine the best of the plant kingdom with the best of the mineral kingdom as a kind of a composite. So like for me, the best of the plant kingdom when it comes to building is you're talking lightweight materials like wood, nailability, sawability, low embodied carbon sequestration. But the best of the mineral kingdom, like stone, is you've got it's anti-combustible, it won't rot, termites don't eat it. So I started becoming obsessed. My holy grail became, how do we combine the best of wood and stone into a composite material? And so I was curious, like, what would happen if instead of using sand or marble dust as the aggregate to our plaster formulas, what if we used biochar? I didn't know if it would work. Biochar and carbon in general is known to be a chemistry killer if it's unmodified. If you were to add it to cement, it destroys the chemistry. So you'll just have a failed puddle of gloop. You won't have something that sets strong. So anyway, I tried it with our material, and by golly, it worked. So I had in the end, it sets a bit longer than normal, but a material that because it's 3/4, it's 50% to 75% biochar. It doesn't burn, super lightweight, doesn't rot. You have the minerals infusing the biochar, gluing it all together and setting it like stone, or lithifying it. And the ramifications of this are just massive, because we're entering an era now of the embodied carbon of our materials is going to make or break, I believe, our success when it comes to carbon drawdown. And it's a crisis in the industry, because architects and developers, for years, they've been trying to raise their ratings with embodied carbon and to score higher with their projects, but there's really no new materials that are capacitating what they want to do. And so they're maxed out, they can't get their ratings higher. And they're actually turning to interior designers now of like, how can you as an interior designer, by what you specify, get us a higher rating, because we can't do anything more. So we just so happen to be 2 years away from the 200th anniversary of ordinary Portland cement. We're just on the cusp of that two century anniversary from when it was invented. And I'm really awestruck by the idea that here we have a new material that's the synthesis of plants, which could capacitate the next 2 centuries in ways that we can only imagine right now.
Well, let's do this. Let's phase into the next segment of this show. So, for anybody that has questions, feel free to be the interviewer as well. So, if you want to go ahead and raise your hand, you're welcome to do that. And to kick this off, we have Mark Voss, who has raised his hand. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, Emily, I'm just so inspired by what I'm hearing. I just have a couple of specific questions. You said that this new material that's going to replace Portland cement is a synthesis of the plant world and the mineral world. And I'm just wondering, what are the mineral components of this? And then what exterior applications are you seeing for this new material?
Yes, so mineral-wise, where we had our real breakthroughs was recognizing the importance of combining calcium with magnesium. Because, for example, if you look at the ocean and seashells, how they're formed in the ocean, yes, it's based on calcium carbonate, but the ocean is basically a magnesium-rich soup. Magnesium is the third most rich element in the ocean. And so magnesium is always in nature working with calcium. And you can see this in your own bones, especially as we age, being prone to osteoporosis if you're lacking in magnesium. So when you look around in nature, there's always this very important ratio and balance between those two elements. Whereas concrete, for example, it doesn't have magnesium in it unless it's an inadvertent impurity. And so it's actually a very brittle and I would say arthritic type of material. And so that was our mineral glue. And then the applications, so we're at the beginning of this commercialization journey, which is a first time experience. And I know we have quite a road ahead of us, and this might come to fruition after I'm dead and gone, because materials take a long time to really impact society, particularly building materials. However, I see the most logical starting point product actually being ceiling tiles, because for a lot of reasons. It takes a lot of liability off our shoulders, and it helps consumer architect and engineering confidence when you're not suggesting a new material for anything that's structural or exterior. So by focusing on non-structural and interior, you take a whole bunch of risk off the table right off the bat. Secondly, I think it's because it doesn't burn, because the biochar is left over from the pyrolysis. It's what does not burn. Having that horizontal fire compartmentalization is incredibly important, especially if you're talking institutional or commercial buildings, because people who are on upper stories are the ones in the most dangerous location of a building, and you need to buy them time to escape. And you also need to do it in such a way that they're not going to get killed by noxious fumes and gases, which a lot of ceiling tiles are, for example, made out of PVC, which can kill you in moments as soon as that starts burning. Like, I really don't understand how that was ever acceptable from a building code perspective. But having it as that type of application would also give additional ratings to people, architects, engineers, developers who want to lower their embodied carbon and to sequester carbon. So I think it's a very logical starting point. And now it's a matter of getting the ASTM tests done to have third-party vetting of what we know to be true, but it's all about third-party vetting, to then allow it to be commercialized. From there, I would be interested in going towards vertical wall surfacing, interior, and exterior. The main challenge we would have, like if we're talking cladding or a rain screen material, is that the biochar is very porous. And so my concern would be, and this was verified by a testing consultant that we have, is that in cold climates, if you have water being absorbed by the material and then undergoing freeze and thaw cycles, what's going to happen? Is it going to spall? Are parts going to delaminate from whatever product you've created? The freeze thaw cycles are a concern for cold climates with such a porous material. So that would be another bridge to cross, but that's definitely more of a phase 3 consideration.
Emily, we have David Todd out of the Hudson Valley, not too far from where you were. But David, do you want to get a question in?
Yeah, she already started to go there, Emily, when you started to gesture about going down the walls. My mind was going to like gypcrete or sheetrock and how this might mimic that and how it does with like shear in terms of wall movement and how it performs that way.
Exactly. That was my original ideal application, because the question becomes, how can we minimize learning curves, lower the barriers to market adoption? How can we take natural high performance materials and provide them to contractors in a way that they don't have to change what they're doing? That's the ideal, because right now in residential construction in the United States, it's 97% drywall oriented. So you're talking stick frame drywall, 97%. That is crazy. And people often say to me like, oh, you can make blocks and bricks. And it's like, yes, in certain countries like Mexico, like India, they're very block oriented building paradigms. But in the United States, it's all about panel construction. And so that was my ideal. However, I do think our material doesn't have quite the ductility or the flexibility that that application requires. I would equate our material to like a lightweight version of terracotta. It has a bit more of a ceramic kind of essence to it. And for those panels, unless we were to play with the dimensions to make them thicker and squatter, the torquing would be potentially an issue. But that would be my ideal. If there was a way to substitute this material for conventional paneling options, Oh my God. Yes. But we also have to be realistic that every material has an essence of what it is and what it's not. And we have to respect the essence of the material. So I'm not sure if that would be the most functionally ideal application, even though commercially it would be.
Emily, we had a question come in from someone that is driving, Walker. He wants to know about the energy required to create biochar.
Yes, so the biochar is really a whole conversation in and of itself. The really interesting thing about biochar is that it's always a waste product to biodiesel production. So making energy, plant-based energy from the biodiesel process and pyrolysis will always create biochar. So in that sense, it's very energy positive. And whereas with making Portland cement, gypsum products as well, you are burning fossil fuels, which is antiquated carbon. In this case, you're actually creating carbon-based energy from contemporary carbon sources. So it's like literally the inverse. And I know there's a lot of debate out there about using biomass as an energy source. And there's good ways to do all things, and there's bad ways to do all things. What I envision for biochar and biodiesel and bioenergy production is integrating it, like, for example, coppiced crops within arable farming systems so that you have perennial crops that you're coppicing down that stabilize arable farming systems that contribute to their resiliency, to their carbon sequestering, to their habitat through hedgerows. That's one way that you can make biochar without infringing on our forests, our working forests. The other aspect to it is you can make biochar by pyrolyzing residues from agriculture. And that is an incredibly interesting angle to it, because residues from agriculture are the only natural resources, maybe other than garbage and feces, that rise in proportion to human population. Pretty much other natural resources tend to get depleted as we multiply, but the residues from agriculture rise as long as we are growing food. So it's an incredibly, I feel, ethical source for biochar that produces energy that we're producing these residues anyway, and doesn't need to compete with forest-based biomass whatsoever. And not only that, but can really represent a region creating its own sources of biomass, of biochar, like regionally appropriate feedstocks. So you're not getting something from halfway around the globe, that you have residues and waste streams that can be converted into biochar in your own backyard, pretty much, certainly your own region.
That's fascinating. Azumi, you've been patiently waiting with your hand raised. Do you want to jump in?
Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Emily. I'm going to veer off a little bit. A lot of the chemistry is a little bit beyond my brain scope, but I was really intrigued in Neil's description of this event, where it says that they do this by enlisting the unique perspective and talents of women.
Yes, that is also a whole nother conversation, but yes, so we are a woman-owned operation. And first of all, you have to recognize that architecture shapes our lives. We've evolved into being an indoor species. We all know we spend 90% of our lives indoors now. That fact has been much touted throughout the pandemic. And people are beginning to recognize the significance of a species that spends 90% of its time indoors, encapsulated by architectural geometry. And the architecture that our lives unfold within it's literally steering our movements throughout the day. And it's more than just a backdrop to our lives. It's an atmosphere to our lives. We're literally breathing, ingesting this atmosphere, for better or for worse. And as a woman, recognizing that the vast majority of architecture that I spend my time in was probably designed by a man, was probably built by a man, and the materials themselves were invented by a man, is a really significant epiphany that my life is unfolding within this male-based geometry that I had no say in from A to Z. And, women tend to be relegated to the decorating sphere and are very associated with interior design and turning a house into a home and decorating it. But I think that is largely stems from the fact that we ourselves have been commodified as decorative objects for the majority of history. And so making decorative objects into decorating beings is a natural extension. And that as a woman living my life in this home and raising a family in this home, I want to know that my priorities have infused the materials, the building process, the design. And yes, it's incredibly important to me. And when I look around this sphere of novel materials and material development, the women who are materials engineers who are involved are, oh my gosh, they are the forces of nature behind some of the most biomimetic, biophilic, cutting edge, pioneering new materials out there. It's Biomason is that masonry company that uses bacteria to carbonate and cure their bricks. That is made by a woman developer. There's a product called Native Air, which also uses biochar out of Germany that has a female founder. Incredible innovations behind transparent wood, behind materials made with fungi, with algae, with bacteria are being done by female innovators around the world with their own startups. So when I look around, now that finally women are being capacitated and supported in their material explorations around the world and their entrepreneurial journeys with this, it's really fascinating what a departure these materials are. And they are, from what I see across the board, they're incredibly biophilic, nature-based solutions that are being created. So really, we're at a juncture now of scaling these technologies. The solutions are all here. There's nothing left to figure out. The solutions are here. It's a matter of scale. And it so happens when you're talking building and the building industry that scaling is a particular challenge because building has such inertia towards change. And I don't mean that in a disparaging way at all. It's valid because when it comes to building, people's lives are at stake. Profit margins for contractors are razor thin. There's no room for error. And so it's resistant to change. It's resistant to risk. It's resistant to liability. And that's fair. I have total empathy for that. But I do think that as we move into a new era where there's pressure from the ground up by consumers, and hopefully there's pressure from the top down with legislation to force the movement to beyond its own inertia to adopting new materials. It's going to have to come from that. I really don't think it's going to come from the industry itself, and for valid reasons. But we're just getting past the point where we can afford to do nothing. We can't afford to not change. So it's coming. Change is coming. Build the change.
That was beautiful. We have maybe a minute, David, if you want to ask a quick question.
Maybe it is a quick one. Yeah, Emily, I really appreciate what you just shared. It's beautiful. And tied with that, what you just shared, and going back to you experimenting in the headlight, and just imagining your place as a laboratory. I'm curious, and with your insights that you're gaining and experimenting with just in your home, even if it's not scalable right now, what other experiments are you working on that are coming from your orientation to architecture and what you inhabit?
Yes, so we're basically, I don't want to express this and dilute the importance of the focus we're putting entirely in cast carbon, which is the name of that material. And actually, you can see our website for it at castcarbon.com. But we do have numerous other material explorations that hopefully once cast carbon is on its merry way, making a difference, we can spin off additional innovations sequentially. But I am working with alternative paints, for example, where we're adding the microspheres of ceramic to make the paints themselves insulative. And I'm also formulating the paints in such a way where water can be added at the point of the project so that paints can be shipped without the additional water weight, which is a huge barrier to it being sold in e-commerce. The weight to profit ratio doesn't work out well in the case of paints. That's why we typically don't buy our paints online compared to paint stores. So being able to subtract water from the equation and add performance enhancements to the paint, I think making the paints themselves insulative is so massive, because most of the insulation battings that we use, whether it's fiberglass or rock wool or even hemp someday, batting style installations always sag and lose thermal properties, as you know, around corners, around doors, around windows. If you look at the image of the house with the thermographic camera, you see all the heat loss. So for me, it's a priority of how do we make rigid materials, whether those are plasters, whether those are boards, whether those are paints, the materials themselves as insulative, basically as continuous insulation around a house, and get rock wool out of the equation. I have to slip this in here. I know everyone loves rock wool and it's taken Passive House by storm, but the energy it takes to make rock wool, you're turning basalt rock into cotton candy that takes 3,000 degree temperatures. And then we're enshrouding our homes in this incredibly energy intensive material. And I know there's payoffs on the back end with utilities, but we have to find alternatives to such energy intensive materials. And so I think paint is part of a breadbasket of solutions towards that. But we're also, we have our version of adobe floors that are infused with our minerals, wood treatments. I like to keep busy.
Emily, with that, I just can't thank you enough. I would love to direct people to learn more about what you're doing in your company. Do you have any websites or social media links that you would like to drop for reference?
You can reach me through our website, phytostone.com. And then, as I mentioned, Cast Carbon as our first baby about to see the world is at castcarbon.com. I personally communicate through email. We have Phytostone Instagram handle. I haven't been on Instagram since Christmas. I'm terrible with social media, so I recommend email.
Well, it was certainly a pleasure to have you come on. And I feel like we're just getting the conversation really, really good and juicy there at the end. And I'm sure it would be a pleasure if we can have you come back and share more about the ways in which you're iterating and bringing this work out into the world.
No, anytime, Neil. And thank you to all of you for your work in the regenerative real estate. Obviously, that is just a massive puzzle piece in the solutions before us. And it's really significant work. And we're all in your debt as well.
Hey, everybody, do you want to just do a quick round of applause since we have a somewhat live audience here and we can go off mute, but yeah. Hey, thanks for tuning in to the show today. If you want to follow our work at Latitude, you can follow us on Instagram at latitude.regenerative.re, and mine is at I am Neil Collins. We inherently believe in the potential that comes from connecting value-aligned and purpose-driven people together in community. That's why I encourage you to join our mighty network and introduce yourself to the other people working across the globe to advance a more regenerative, resilient, and beautiful world. Here, we want to know what you're working on and what inspires you. Through this platform, you can attend live events, take courses provided by our podcast guests, and create connection with other people and businesses that share your same passion. To join, find the link in our show notes or visit our website at chooselatitude.com. If you'd like to support the show, please share it with your friends and be sure to follow us on your podcast app so that you always have the latest episode downloaded. Another way to support our regenerative field building is to leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. Positive ratings help attract amazing guests, and they can be the deciding factor for someone else to tune in and listen. And who knows, maybe this is the kind of motivation that it takes for them to finally decide to align their profession with their sustainable and regenerative values and become a positive force for good within their own community. This show was produced by myself and edited by Anthony Wallace and offered as a part of our work with Latitude Regenerative Real Estate.